In so many ways, we are living in historic times. The worldwide anti Black racism protest movement, the pandemic, and economic turmoil. It's a lot. What do Canadians think of it all? Well, to find out, we often like to ask what the artificial intelligence algorithm known as Polly detects out there. Erin Kelly is the CEO of Advanced Symbolics Inc., which is where Polly works, so to speak. And Erin joins us now from the nation's capital. Good to have you back on, Erin. How are you managing these days?
Very well, thanks, Steve.
Good. Glad to hear it. Let's start out with what is clearly the most topical thing on all of our television sets, on our radio sets. What we're reading about, we are completely focused right now on the anti-Black racism protests. What do Canadians have to say to Polly about that?
Well, they have to say a lot. We see over 4 million Canadians engaged on this topic across the country, and 90% agree that the police have too much power, that racism in this country is systemic, and people want to see change. Now, what form that change should take, that's where we see more nuanced conversation, more disagreement, but everybody is in agreement that racism is a big problem in this country.
That is an astonishing number. I suspect you can't get 90% of the people to agree that the sky is blue today. So the fact that 90% have coalesced around that, I mean, can I assume that you rarely see that kind of coming together on a single issue? Is that fair to say?
I don't know that I've ever seen it. And not only that, but what's really interesting, we can ask Polly how many people are new to the conversation. So we set the clock back to January 1st, 2019, and we said, we don't want you to count anybody who has ever talked about racism before. So for new voices, just tell us how many people have joined this conversation who have never talked about racism before. And it was 53% are new to this conversation just since the George Floyd killing. So that's astonishing for us as well, because we consider 30% to be the making of a movement. So 53%, especially with a topic like racism, which is broad, it's astonishing that we have 53% increased conversation, and that conversation is um, is is supporting Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities in the country.
An enormous amount of interest in a very short period of time. So let's drill a little deeper on that. Can you tell us about the age or the demographic or the socioeconomic conditions of the people who are now suddenly tuned into this issue? Does that tell us anything about the state of the conversation?
You know, it's really interesting. We originally thought our theory was that it would be young people, but no, it's across every age range, senior citizens, men, women, white, just it's across the board, really. And people who are, I said it's 90% agreement, even the 10% are really more disagreeing on the severity of it or whether or not it's just a police issue. So really, there's very few people in any demographic who are saying everything's good. So leaders in our country have very high support for changing the system and doing something about this issue.
Having said that, how much support for the police in general still exists out there?
You know, it's interesting. So when we look at, for example, defunding the police, there is very little support actually for defunding the police. Now, this might be because people don't understand exactly what would replace the police. Um, People feel that the police, that there's a conversation that I think is very interesting, saying the police are really the the front line and the face of this problem. That racism in the country is systemic. It exists in every profession in the country, but the police are at the front line, because when you have a problem, you're not calling the AI scientist to come and save you. I'm not running around the city with a gun. So you don't see the racism in other professions the way you see it in the police. So that just defunding the police is actually not going to solve the problem of racism that we have in the country. And that's why defunding the police is not seen as the solution. Perhaps if there was more talk about what we need to do, um, make our community stronger. There's definitely a strong desire for reform and to change the way policing happens, but only about 9% of the population actually agrees with defunding the police. And there's a lot of cynicism about that as well. Think because a lot of city councilors have said, I would support defunding the police, people are seeing this as um, cost saving rather than fixing a problem. So there's not a lot of support for that, but there's definitely support for reform.
Yeah, I don't know about this, so I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and you can, if you've got the data, you can certainly obviously push back against this. But my hunch is people don't know what defund the police means, and we did a program about this last Friday, which is why I'm a little bit up on this. And the idea isn't that you take all the money away from every police service in the province or country. The idea is that where the police are now responding to, for example, domestic disputes or mental health crises, or the kinds of things where a law enforcement response is probably not called for, that some other kind of social service response might be called for, that's the part of the police budget we ought to be defunding. Do you think there is an understanding in the country that that's what defunding the police actually means?
No, I don't think so. And here's why I think it's being confused. When we looked at universal basic income, which was one of the topics that your viewers asked us to look at, we saw high support for universal basic income in Canada as a solution to poverty, as a solution to the inequities that we see. And when you think about the defunding the police movement and universal basic income, they have a lot in common, and yet one has high support and the other does not. And I think it's because defunding sounds very negative. It's open to cynicism. People are saying, well, what's the plan? Uh, there's um, there's doubt whether that money will be properly invested in communities. People are saying, okay, councillors just want to save some money and cut the police budget, and they're jumping on this bandwagon as an opportunity. And there's cynicism that that will actually happen. So, but because of the support that we see for universal basic income, we do think that there is support there for social endeavors, and that if the people who support defunding the police were to come up with a concrete plan about what that would look like, and to ensure people that law and order will still be here, and that when you call 911 because you're being assaulted, you're not going to get a busy signal because we've defunded the police. That is the concern. So if we can come up with a positive plan as opposed to let's just defund the police, which people see as a knee-jerk reaction, then I think you'll get more support.
Understood. I do want to follow up with you on, because the last time you were here, you did put the call out there, said, well, whatever people want to know about, we're happy to poll on. So we'll get to that in a second, but I want to ask you a couple of more things about the more immediate circumstances we find ourselves in right now. I don't know whether you would have information from something that just happened last Friday, but clearly the Prime Minister made quite a splash when he participated in that anti-Black racism protest and took the knee along with the other demonstrators. It was quite an iconic image. Do you know whether, well, how do people react when they see something like that?
Well, generally they react positively. So people were happy that Mr. Trudeau took the knee. However, there's definitely a big portion of the population, well, a sizable portion of the population that wants to see that followed up with something. And there was definitely criticism that the Prime Minister had said in the past that he was going to be the champion of Indigenous people, and feeling that he failed on that. He has a history, of course, with brownface, which came up again. So people are willing to look past that and be positive about it, but he needs to follow that up with action for sure.
And how about the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford? What's Paulie having to say about the job he's doing right now?
With regard to the racism issue, people aren't talking a lot about Mr. Ford, actually, because I think he hasn't been coming out as strongly on this. There were people talking about the announcements he'd made and some funding and some promises, but he's not getting as much attention on this issue as he is on other issues, or even as much as the Prime Minister is getting.
It's interesting. He did say the other day, was it yesterday? It was either yesterday. I think it was yesterday, that he was asked a question about how can you tell people to respect physical distancing and not to gather in groups of more than 5 or now 10, as the case may be, and yet you have nothing bad to say about all the demonstrators who were in the street protesting against anti-Black racism. And my hunch is the old Doug Ford might have come down hard on that protest, but the new Doug Ford certainly expressed great sympathy and empathy with the aims of those who were protesting in the streets. You got any numbers, or what does Polly have to say about the new Doug Ford versus the old Doug Ford?
The new Doug Ford is getting lots of kudos. People are liking this new Doug Ford. He seems to be much more empathetic than he was given credit for in the past. So he's definitely understanding the situation, and he's showing a high emotional intelligence, I would say. We did see people point out that COVID does not discriminate why you're protesting. So why was it not okay for people to protest the closures, but it's okay to protest racism? But people overall felt that this was an important enough issue that we shouldn't be criticizing people venting their anger this way. So it definitely was seen as contradictory. But overall, I think people's feelings about this topic and this issue are strong enough that I think Mr. Ford reacted the right way.
Now, here's the key question, of course, going forward, which is George Floyd was not the first black man, sadly, killed by police in inexplicable circumstances. And in the past, there have been demonstrations, and they reached a moment, and then the moment faded. What does Paulie have to say about whether or not this moment in history can be something more sustainable?
It's sustainable. What we're seeing for this one, so for example, as I mentioned, we look at new voices, and we trace new voices for the Colton Boushie shooting. We trace new voices for the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement had 34% new voices. This has 53%. So this is a movement. There's no question that this is having a big impact. And why did this have a bigger impact? It was because of how much time it took, how the people on the sidewalk were saying, get off of him. This is different from before the police could say, well, I reacted quickly, I shot, I thought my life was in danger. This was clearly not that situation. And so it has really left an impact on people because they feel they watched it unfold. And so that's not going away.
Okay, let's move on now to the topics that some of our viewers asked you to look into. And how about this one? When it comes to the federal government raising taxes to pay for programs related to COVID relief, where do Canadians stand on those tax increases?
Yeah, so normally when we look at tax increases, it's always, I don't want them and negative. I think in this case, the conversation's a little bit different because people feel it's almost inevitable. So what people are discussing is ideas for how we're going to deal with the deficit. And so some of the ones that are bubbling up, people are saying that in April, the Prime Minister brought in a 50% increase on carbon tax, for example. So they want to see that 100% going to, because that's new revenue, or it should be new revenue, that should go to dealing with the deficit on COVID, increases in, say, cigarette tax or alcohol. What there isn't widespread support for is a COVID tax, because people feel that we're being punished for COVID again. Definitely not a tax on the middle class. Not a lot of support for tax on business, because people feel that businesses are going to need the money to rebuild. So usually you do see support for taxes on business. Where there is support on income tax, it's in the 1%, of course, tax the wealthy, but also these other, not a general consumption tax, but targeted consumption taxes. So people are trying to have a constructive conversation. Oh, and the other thing that people said is they want to see a reduction in foreign aid if we're going to be raising our taxes to pay for COVID. People were upset about increased spending offshore when so many Canadians are suffering. So those are some of the conversations that we're seeing. Of course, overall, people are not happy about tax increases, and they'd like to see some spending decrease to go with that. But again, there's not a lot of support for that because people feel that there's a lot of rebuilding required.
Well, let's do a little deeper dive on the deficit here. The Trudeau government, in the 5 years it's been in power, has run deficits of about 20 billion, 30 billion-ish per year. The deficit this year is going to be north of $250 billion. How fussed are people about that?
They're very concerned about it, and that number is floating around. It's being reposted, and so people are very aware of it, and there is big concern. And so people are debating, what do we do about it? There's definitely quite a bit of anxiety that once we get over the current situation, we are going to be left with a very big deficit, and we're going to have to pay for that as well.
Any sense about how we would get out of the deficit? I know there are some people who believe that over time, you can kind of grow your way out of it. Other people believe you're going to have to raise taxes on the next generations down in order to pay for it. Other people say you're going to have to dramatically cut back spending massively. What does Polly have to say about the preferred options?
The preferred options are cut back spending. Yes, we're seeing that, especially in foreign outside the country. And as I mentioned, very targeted tax increases on certain populations. But there's concern that the middle class is already very damaged economically from this pandemic and would not be able to shoulder big tax increases in a short period of time.
Hmm.
Some people are
Is
saying
there
27% are saying they're already borrowing to for basics, so they're definitely not up for increased taxes.
Hmm. And let me do a follow up on the business angle as well, because you did say there was some sympathy for businesses' plight out there right now. But is there an appetite for additional government programming, for example, to help small businesses in the out of the jam they're in right now?
There's a bit of cynicism there when it comes to businesses because a lot of people are saying a lot of the businesses that have been helped so far were actually in trouble before the pandemic hit. And so there's there's um, there's conversation about whether or not the government is able to judge a business that with some help would do well and create jobs, and a business that is just taking advantage of government programs and is just being kept on life support until those programs go away, and then the business goes under, and then we've just wasted that money. So there is a lot of concern that the that we actually have to start taking back those programs and see which businesses can survive the opening.
I gather somebody had a very specific question about business interruption insurance and what the status of that might be. You got anything on that?
Yeah, we actually had quite a few people write about that. People were saying business interruption fee. I think what they meant was business interruption insurance. We saw, especially in Ontario, so that's probably why we got this question. A lot of small businesses said that they had insurance for business interruption and they were not covered by COVID. Now, then we had a lot of insurers come in and say it doesn't cover pandemics, it covers physical damage to the business. But there was a lot of other lawyers were coming in saying that there's actually precedent for it not just being physical damage. So we're seeing people start to talk about class action lawsuits, but we're seeing over 70% of Ontario businesses saying that they feel hard done by the insurance companies through this pandemic.
Hmm. And I wonder about auto insurance because the stuff I hear about all the time, people send me emails all the time saying, I haven't driven my car in 2.5 months and yet I'm still paying the same auto insurance. That can't be fair. You hearing anything about that?
We didn't look on that, but it
No,
wouldn't
trust me, it's
surprise
out
me.
there.
I'm definitely seeing people say I'm
Yeah.
so happy with how much I'm saving from my commute,
Hmm.
but I haven't looked on specifically on auto insurance.
Okay. Talk to us, Aaron, about this, because if there's one demographic in our society right now that feels um, particularly disproportionately affected by the ravages of this pandemic, it's those in the disability world. And everything from whether or not they're going to get a fair shake if there's a fight for a ventilator at a hospital, everything from that to the notion that they felt ripped off. For example, that the government was there to help with the CERB, for example, to help those who'd lost their jobs. But for people with disabilities who have got an even tougher time now, given the limitations in which we're living, they see that they see their rights even further infringed upon and their potential in even more difficulty right now. Polly, have anything to say about the plight of the disabled right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This question came up from your viewers, and it was actually the issue that had the most traction out of all the questions that were asked. I mentioned that there was a 53% increase in new voices on racism. It was 80% on people with special needs and disabilities. Um, just a groundswell since March, since the lockdown happened, of people with disabilities and people who support people with disabilities, people who live close to people with disabilities, saying everything from caring for children who are not getting the care and the therapy that they need, um, having to wear masks and the impact on that for people who are deaf and they rely on reading lips to communicate, and the lack of support, um, being in lockdown, not having anybody to assist them, all those services that went away. There was a lot of distress there, and it's still there despite recent announcements of support. We are definitely seeing, we've talked a lot about as a society about seniors. I think it's really time. Well, we're at the point now where we're getting to the end of the lockdowns, but definitely as we reopen, making sure we have support for people with special needs. We definitely see a lot of distress out there.
Yeah, those of us who are fortunate enough to hear may not appreciate the fact that if we wear a mask to protect ours and others' health in this pandemic, that means people who read lips can't tell at all what we're saying. So that's something else we have to keep in mind. Erin, it's really good of you to join us tonight. You be well, and we'll check back in down the road, okay?
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.